In the summer of 1887, 13-year-old Mary Catherine Walsh stepped out of her family's covered wagon to pick wild berries along the treacherous rim of Devil's Canyon in Wyoming Territory. When her parents called for supper an hour later, only silence answered back. For 3 weeks, search parties combed the deadly ravines and jagged rock faces, finding nothing but her torn blue ribbon caught on a thorn bush. The canyon had swallowed her whole, they said. Her mother wept over an empty grave. But Mary wasn't dead. Somewhere in the maze of caves and hidden springs that honeycombed the canyon walls, a skinny girl from Ohio was learning to survive like the ancient peoples who once called this land home. She was drinking water that pooled in stone basins, eating roots and insects, and sleeping in caves that sheltered her from mountain lions and bears. What nobody knew was that high above on the canyon rim, a young Crow scout named Running Wolf had been watching. He'd seen the flash of her torn dress moving between the rocks. He'd noticed the small footprints in the mud near hidden water sources, but tribal lore and bitter history with white settlers kept him silent, even as his conscience wrestled with letting a child suffer alone in the wilderness. The question that haunted everyone was simple. How does a 13-year-old girl survive 3 weeks in one of the most dangerous canyons in the American West? And what finally made a Native American scout break decades of mistrust to save the life of a white pioneer child? This is the true story of Mary Catherine Walsh, the girl who vanished into Devil's Canyon and emerged changed forever, carrying secrets that would bridge two worlds and challenge everything her family believed about survival, trust, and the meaning of home on the frontier. The wagon wheels creaked a steady rhythm against the rocky trail as the Walsh family made their way through Wyoming Territory in July 1887. Mary Catherine Walsh sat in the back of the covered wagon, her legs dangling over the edge, watching the landscape change from rolling grasslands to something wilder and more dangerous. The 13-year-old had been traveling with her parents and 2 younger brothers for nearly 4 months, leaving their failed farm in Ohio behind for the promise of free land in Oregon Territory. Her father, Thomas Walsh, was a man of few words but strong determination. He'd lost everything in the economic troubles that swept through Ohio, and this journey west represented his family's last hope for a fresh start. Her mother, Elizabeth, tried to keep spirits up with stories and songs, but Mary could see the worry lines deepening around her eyes as their supplies dwindled and the terrain grew more treacherous. They were part of a small wagon train of 7 families led by an experienced guide named Captain Morrison, who knew the dangers of this particular stretch of country. Devil's Canyon lay directly ahead, a massive gash in the earth that stretched for miles, with walls that dropped hundreds of feet to a rocky bottom. The trail skirted the canyon's rim, offering spectacular but terrifying views of the chasm below. As the afternoon sun beat down mercilessly, Captain Morrison called for a rest stop near a cluster of stunted pine trees. The wagons formed a loose circle, and the adults began the familiar routine of watering the oxen and checking wagon wheels for damage. The children, restless from hours of sitting, scattered to explore their surroundings under strict orders not to wander far. Mary Catherine was different from most pioneer girls her age, where others might be content with helping their mothers with domestic chores. She possessed an insatiable curiosity about the world around her. She could identify bird calls, track small animals, and had an unusual ability to find her way in unfamiliar terrain. These skills had served her well during the long journey, often helping her family supplement their dwindling food supplies with wild edibles she discovered. On this particular afternoon, she noticed clusters of what appeared to be wild service berries growing along the canyon's edge. The family's food stores were running low, and fresh fruit would be a welcome addition to their monotonous diet of hardtack and beans. She called to her mother about the berries, received a distracted wave of approval, and set off with her small wicker basket. The berries were indeed ripe and abundant, growing on bushes that clung precariously to the rocky soil near the canyon's rim. Mary worked her way along the edge, careful to stay well back from the crumbling precipice, filling her basket with the sweet purple fruit. The afternoon was peaceful, with only the sound of wind through the rocks and the distant calls of her fellow travelers. It was then that she heard something unusual, a sound that didn't belong in this wilderness setting. From somewhere deep in the canyon came what sounded like the cry of a child. Mary froze, listening intently. There it was again, faint but unmistakably human, echoing up from the rocky depths below. Without thinking, she moved closer to the edge, straining to see into the shadows far below. The canyon walls were not uniformly vertical. In places, they stepped down in a series of rocky ledges and narrow terraces. If someone had fallen, they might have landed on one of these natural shelves rather than plummeting all the way to the bottom. The cry came again, and this time Mary was certain it was a child's voice. Perhaps another family had passed this way and lost someone to a fall. She knew she should return to the wagons and alert the adults. But by the time she convinced them and organized a rescue party, precious time would be lost. If someone was injured and trapped down there, they might not survive a delay. Mary had always been the most agile climber among her siblings. Back in Ohio, she'd scrambled up barn walls and climbed trees that her brothers wouldn't dare attempt. The canyon wall, while intimidating, showed possible handholds and footholds carved by wind and water over countless years. She secured her basket of berries to a sturdy bush and began her descent. The first few feet were manageable, with good grips and solid footing. But as she worked her way down, the rock became more treacherous. Ancient sedimentary layers had weathered unevenly, creating a maze of loose stones and crumbling edges. 15 feet down, disaster struck. Mary reached for what appeared to be a solid handhold, but the rock crumbled in her grip. She lost her balance and began sliding down the steep face, unable to arrest her fall. Small stones cascaded around her as she bumped and scraped against the canyon wall, her dress tearing on sharp projections. She fell for what felt like an eternity but was probably only seconds, finally coming to rest on a narrow ledge about 40 feet below the rim. Pain shot through her left ankle, and her hands and knees were scraped raw from the rock. Blood seeped through the tears in her dress, and she felt dizzy from the shock of the fall. Above her, the rim seemed impossibly far away. The walls rose in an almost vertical line, with few handholds visible from her current position. Even if her ankle weren't injured, she doubted she could make the climb back up. Below her, the canyon dropped away into shadows, with more ledges and terraces visible in the fading light. As the reality of her situation sank in, Mary called out for help. Her voice echoed strangely in the canyon, bouncing off the walls and fading into whispers. She shouted until her throat was raw, but no answering voices came from above. The wagon train was too far away, and the wind carried her cries away from the camp, rather than toward it. Meanwhile, back at the wagons, Elizabeth Walsh was beginning to worry. Mary had been gone for over an hour, much longer than it should have taken to pick berries. She asked the other children if they'd seen her daughter, but none had noticed which direction Mary had gone after leaving camp. Thomas Walsh organized a search party as the sun began to sink toward the horizon. They found Mary's berry basket tied to a bush near the canyon's edge, with a clear trail of disturbed earth leading to the rim. Peering over the edge, they could see scuff marks and loose stones on the canyon wall below, but the growing darkness made it impossible to see any further details. Captain Morrison made the difficult decision that many pioneer leaders faced in such situations. They could not risk more lives attempting a nighttime rescue in treacherous terrain. They would have to wait for morning light and proper equipment. The entire wagon train made camp on the spot, despite being in exposed position with limited water. That first night was agony for the Walsh family. Elizabeth sat vigil by the canyon's edge, calling Mary's name into the darkness and listening desperately for any response. Thomas and the other men worked by firelight to prepare ropes and plan a rescue attempt for dawn. The two younger Walsh boys huddled together in the wagon, unable to understand why their sister didn't simply come home when called. Down on her ledge, Mary experienced her first night alone in the wilderness. The temperature dropped dramatically after sunset, and her torn dress provided little warmth against the cold stone. She discovered a shallow depression in the rock wall behind her, barely deep enough to provide shelter from the wind, and curled up inside with her arms wrapped around her knees. Sleep came in brief, fitful intervals between periods of shivering and worry. Strange sounds echoed through the canyon during the night. Animal calls she couldn't identify, and the constant whisper of wind through the rocks. Once, she thought she heard the distant howl of wolves, sending a chill through her that had nothing to do with the cold. As dawn broke over the canyon, Mary could see her situation more clearly. The ledge she occupied was perhaps 6 feet wide and 12 feet long, with a scatter of loose stones and a few hardy plants growing in cracks in the rock. Water stains on the stone suggested that rain sometimes pooled here, but the surface was currently dry. Above her, the early morning light revealed the true challenge of the canyon wall. The route she had fallen down was not climbable without proper equipment. But looking along the canyon wall, she could see other ledges and terraces, some connected by narrow paths worn by wind, water, and perhaps the passage of wild animals over the centuries. From above, she heard voices calling her name. She shouted back as loudly as she could, and was overjoyed to hear her father's voice responding. But when he appeared at the canyon's edge, the distance between them seemed impossibly vast. Even with the ropes they had brought, the rescue party couldn't reach her position safely. For 3 days, the wagon train remained camped at the canyon's rim, while the men attempted various rescue strategies. They tried lowering ropes from different positions, looking for a route down the canyon wall that might be more manageable. But the rock was treacherous, with loose stones that could trigger avalanches, and the ledge where Mary was trapped was positioned in a way that made direct access nearly impossible. Captain Morrison faced a difficult decision that tested his leadership and humanity. The wagon train was already behind schedule, their supplies were running low, and remaining in this exposed position much longer would endanger the entire group. Other families had children too, and their lives couldn't be risked indefinitely for one person, even a child. On the fourth day, he made the announcement that would haunt the Walsh family forever. They would have to continue west, leaving markers and messages for any other travelers who might be better equipped to attempt a rescue. Thomas Walsh refused to abandon his daughter, but Elizabeth, seeing the faces of the other families and their own younger children, made the heartbreaking decision to convince her husband they had to think of their surviving family members. The wagon train moved on, leaving behind improvised grave markers and messages carved into trees, telling any future travelers about the girl trapped in Devil's Canyon. Elizabeth Walsh collapsed with grief as their wagon pulled away from the rim, and Thomas rode in stony silence, his face aged years in just a few days. But Mary Catherine Walsh was far from dead. As the sound of the wagon train faded into the distance, she realized she was truly on her own in one of the most unforgiving landscapes in the American West. The choice before her was simple: find a way to survive in this rocky maze or die trying. She chose to survive, beginning a journey that would test every skill she had learned during her 13 years of life and teach her new ones she never could have imagined needing. The first challenge was water. She had been surviving on the small amount in her canteen, but that was nearly gone. In the early morning hours, she began exploring the network of ledges and narrow paths that connected different levels of the canyon wall. Moving carefully to avoid putting weight on her injured ankle, she discovered that the canyon held secrets invisible from the rim above. Hidden springs seeped from cracks in the rock face, creating small pools where water collected in natural stone basins. Some of these pools were covered with green algae and alive with insects, but others were clear and cold, fed by underground streams that had been flowing through this canyon for thousands of years. Mary learned to test water by watching for animal tracks around the pools and observing whether birds and small mammals drank from them safely. Food was a more complex problem. The service berries that had originally lured her into the canyon grew sparsely on the rocky walls, and she quickly exhausted the easily accessible sources. But careful observation revealed other possibilities. Certain types of cactus pads could be eaten after the spines were carefully removed. The inner bark of some trees, when available, could be chewed for nutrition, and in the deeper parts of the canyon, she found patches of wild onions and other edible roots that had been overlooked by larger animals. The most challenging part of survival was learning to think like the animals that shared this harsh environment. Mary began to notice the subtle signs that indicated safe paths, good water sources, and potential shelter. She watched birds to understand weather patterns and followed animal tracks to discover hidden resources. 1 week into her ordeal, she made a discovery that probably saved her life. Following a narrow trail that seemed to lead deeper into the canyon's interior, she found a series of natural caves carved into the rock face by ancient water flow. These caves provided shelter from the extreme temperature variations between day and night, and some contained evidence that humans had used them long before any pioneer families crossed this territory. In one cave, she found fragments of pottery and the remains of ancient fire pits, suggesting that Native American peoples had once used this area as shelter. More importantly, she discovered that some of these caves had natural chimneys that provided ventilation and openings to the surface that were invisible from above. This network of caves and passages would become her home for the remainder of her time in the canyon. As days turned into weeks, Mary developed routines and skills that transformed her from a lost pioneer girl into something approaching a wild creature herself. She learned to move silently through the canyon to avoid attracting predators. She discovered which plants could be used to treat her injuries and which provided the most nutrition. She even learned to predict weather changes by observing the behavior of the canyon's wildlife. But perhaps most importantly, she was being watched. High above on the canyon rim, a young Crow scout named Running Wolf had observed the failed rescue attempts and the departure of the wagon train. He had also noticed signs that the girl had not died in her fall, as everyone assumed. His keen eyes picked up traces that the white rescuers had missed: disturbed earth around water sources, broken vegetation along animal paths, and other subtle indicators that someone was moving through the canyon's hidden places. Running Wolf faced a dilemma that cut to the heart of the complex relationships between Native American peoples and white settlers in this region. His people had suffered greatly from contact with pioneers and soldiers. Treaties had been broken, hunting grounds destroyed, and many of his relatives had died from diseases brought by white settlers. Helping this lost white child went against everything his experience had taught him about these invaders. Yet she was just a child, alone and vulnerable in a landscape that could kill even experienced warriors. As Running Wolf continued his silent observation, he began to see something that changed his perspective. This girl was not simply surviving. She was learning to live in harmony with the canyon in ways that reminded him of his own people's ancient relationship with the land. The situation was about to reach a critical juncture as Mary's body began to weaken from the constant stress of survival and her limited diet, while Running Wolf wrestled with the decision that would test his deepest beliefs about honor, compassion, and the meaning of humanity in an age of bitter conflict between peoples. By her second week in Devil's Canyon, Mary Catherine Walsh had transformed from a terrified lost child into something approaching a creature of the wilderness itself. The girl who had once worried about keeping her dress clean and sang her prayers before meals now moved through the rocky maze with an animal's wariness, her senses sharpened by constant danger and the daily challenge of staying alive. Her injured ankle had healed enough to bear weight, though it remained tender and weak. More importantly, she had learned to navigate the canyon's treacherous paths without relying solely on her feet. Sometimes she crawled along narrow ledges where a single misstep would mean death. Other times she used her hands and arms to swing between rock holds, moving more like a mountain goat than a human being. The network of caves she had discovered became her sanctuary and her school. The largest cave, which she privately named her sitting room, contained the ancient pottery fragments and fire pits that spoke of previous human habitation. But as Mary explored deeper into the cave system, she found something even more remarkable. Walls covered with paintings and symbols left by the indigenous peoples who had once sheltered here. The paintings depicted animals she recognized, deer and elk and buffalo, but also hunting scenes and what appeared to be maps of the surrounding terrain. Some symbols were repeated often enough that Mary began to understand they might represent water sources or safe passages. Though she couldn't read the ancient language of lines and colors, she sensed these walls contained survival wisdom accumulated over generations. One particular painting caught her attention repeatedly. It showed a human figure surrounded by various animals, but instead of hunting or fighting them, the person appeared to be learning from them. Birds seemed to be showing the human where to find food, while a bear demonstrated how to dig for roots. The image suggested a relationship with nature that was fundamentally different from anything Mary had learned in her frontier upbringing. This painting became her inspiration as she developed her own relationship with the canyon's wildlife. Instead of seeing the animals as threats to be avoided or resources to be exploited, she began observing them as teachers who had mastered the art of survival in this harsh environment. The ravens were her first instructors. These intelligent blackbirds seemed to thrive in the canyon, and Mary noticed they always knew where to find water, even when the obvious sources had dried up in the summer heat. By following ravens at dawn, she discovered hidden springs tucked into crevices she would never have found on her own. The birds also served as an early warning system, their harsh cries alerting her when predators were moving through her territory. Chipmunks and ground squirrels taught her about food storage. Mary watched these small creatures gathering seeds and nuts, noting which plants they favored and which they avoided. She began creating her own food caches in different caves, storing dried berries and edible roots against the possibility of injury or storms that might keep her confined for days. More dangerous teachers included the mountain lions and bears that occasionally passed through the canyon. Mary never encountered these predators directly, but their tracks and scent markings taught her about the rhythm of their movements and the territories they claimed. She learned to recognize the warning signs that indicated when large predators were active in her area, and how to avoid crossing their paths during feeding or mating seasons. The canyon's smaller predators proved more immediately challenging. Rattlesnakes were common among the rocks, and Mary had several terrifying encounters before learning to recognize their preferred hiding spots and the subtle vibrations that announced their presence. Poisonous spiders lurked in dark crevices, and stinging insects could turn a peaceful afternoon into agony if she wasn't careful about where she placed her hands and feet. But perhaps the most valuable education came from the canyon's weather patterns. Summer thunderstorms could turn dry creek beds into raging torrents within minutes, and Mary learned to read the subtle signs that preceded these dangerous floods. Flash floods had carved the very caves where she sheltered, and she discovered evidence of high watermarks that showed how dramatically the canyon could change during severe storms. One afternoon, dark clouds began gathering over the canyon rim, while Mary was foraging for edible roots in what appeared to be a dry creek bed. The air grew still and heavy, and she noticed the ravens becoming agitated, flying in circles and calling to each other with harsh cries. Every animal instinct she had developed over the past week screamed danger, though the sky seemed only normally overcast. She abandoned her foraging and scrambled up the canyon wall toward her caves, moving as quickly as her still tender ankle would allow. She had barely reached the safety of her highest shelter when the storm struck with terrifying fury. Rain poured into the canyon in sheets, and within minutes she could hear the roar of water rushing through the creek bed, where she had been standing just moments before. From the mouth of her cave, Mary watched in fascination and terror as the canyon transformed. Waterfalls appeared on the canyon walls where none had existed before, pouring from the rim high above. The normally quiet creek became a brown torrent carrying trees, rocks, and debris. The water rose high enough to flood some of her lower caves, washing away food stores she had carefully accumulated. The storm lasted only an hour, but it taught Mary lessons that would serve her for the remainder of her time in the canyon. She moved her food caches to higher, more secure locations. She identified multiple escape routes from any area where she might be foraging or exploring. Most importantly, she learned to trust the subtle warnings that nature provided to those wise enough to pay attention. As her third week in the canyon began, Mary had developed routines that would have seemed impossible during her first terrified nights on the ledge. She woke before dawn in her cave, drinking water from a natural stone basin that collected condensation during the night. Her breakfast might consist of pine nuts gathered from scattered cones, supplemented by the tender inner bark of certain trees that provided both nutrition and moisture. The early morning hours were devoted to gathering food and water for the day. Mary had learned that many edible plants were most easily found and harvested in the cooler hours before the sun reached into the canyon. She also used this time to check and maintain her various food caches, rotating stored items to prevent spoilage and replacing materials that showed signs of insect damage. The heat of midday drove her to the deepest, coolest caves, where she spent hours studying the ancient paintings and symbols. Without conscious intention, she was absorbing survival knowledge that had been accumulated over centuries by people who understood how to live in harmony with this harsh environment. The paintings began to make more sense as her own experience grew, revealing details about seasonal patterns, animal behavior, and resource locations that she might never have discovered on her own. Afternoons were often spent on what she came to think of as scouting expeditions, careful explorations of parts of the canyon she hadn't yet visited. These journeys were always dangerous, requiring her to test each handhold and foothold before committing her weight, but they gradually expanded her understanding of the canyon's geography and resources. During one such expedition, Mary made a discovery that initially thrilled her, but ultimately filled her with a new kind of loneliness. Following what appeared to be an ancient path carved into the canyon wall, she found herself at the bottom of Devil's Canyon for the first time since her fall. Here, a permanent stream flowed between towering walls, creating a green oasis hidden deep in the earth. The canyon floor was rich with plant and animal life. Wild mint grew along the stream banks, providing both food and natural medicine. Berry bushes flourished in the filtered sunlight that reached between the canyon walls. Animal tracks crisscrossed the sandy soil, indicating that many creatures came here to drink and feed. But what captured Mary's attention most was clear evidence of human presence, both ancient and more recent. Stone circles marked where fires had been built, and scattered around them were the remains of tools and pottery that spoke of regular human habitation. Some of these artifacts were clearly very old, weathered by countless seasons, but others appeared more recent, suggesting that people still used this hidden place for shelter and gathering. The discovery filled Mary with hope and terror in equal measure. The presence of other humans meant the possibility of rescue, but it also meant potential danger. She had no way of knowing whether the people who used this place would help a lost white child or see her as a threat to be eliminated. Her weeks in the canyon had taught her that survival often depended on remaining invisible and avoiding contact with any creature larger than herself. Mary decided to establish a hidden observation post near the canyon floor, where she could watch for human activity without revealing her presence. She found a concealed position among the rocks, where she could see the entire area while remaining hidden, and began keeping regular watch during the hours when people would be most likely to travel. Her patience was rewarded on her 5th day of observation. Just after sunrise, 3 figures appeared at the far end of the canyon floor, moving silently along the stream bank. Even at a distance, Mary could see they were Native Americans, dressed in traditional hunting clothes and moving with the practiced stealth of people completely at home in the wilderness. The hunting party consisted of 2 older men and 1 younger person who might have been a teenager. They moved efficiently through the area, gathering specific plants and checking what appeared to be hunting snares placed along game trails. Their knowledge of the canyon was obviously extensive, and they worked with the quiet confidence of people who had been coming to this place for years. Mary watched in fascination as the hunters demonstrated survival skills that far surpassed her own hard-won knowledge. They found food sources she had missed entirely, identified subtle tracking signs she couldn't even see, and moved through the terrain with an efficiency that made her own careful progress seem clumsy by comparison. But what impressed her most was their relationship with the canyon environment. These men didn't seem to be fighting against the harsh conditions or trying to dominate the landscape. Instead, they appeared to be working in partnership with the natural world, taking only what they needed and leaving no trace of their presence beyond the carefully placed snares that would continue providing food for future visits. The hunting party remained in the canyon for 3 days, and Mary watched them every moment they were visible. She learned more about survival techniques during those 3 days than in all her previous weeks of solitary struggle. But she also faced an agonizing decision about whether to reveal herself and ask for help. Everything in her pioneer upbringing told her that Indians were dangerous, that contact with them would likely mean death or captivity. The stories she had heard around wagon train campfires painted Native Americans as savage enemies who showed no mercy to white settlers, particularly women and children. But her weeks in the canyon had taught her to question many of the assumptions she had carried from her old life. These hunters showed a reverence for the land and a level of survival knowledge that commanded her respect. They took time to repair damage caused by flash floods, clean debris from the stream, and carefully maintained the area for future use. Their behavior suggested a completely different relationship with the natural world than anything Mary had learned from white society. On their final morning in the canyon, Mary made a decision that surprised herself. Instead of revealing her presence directly, she left a small gift at one of their campsites. A handful of especially choice pine nuts she had gathered, arranged in a pattern that couldn't be mistaken for natural occurrence. It was a gesture of respect and gratitude, a way of acknowledging what they had taught her without demanding anything in return. When the hunting party discovered her gift, their reaction confirmed Mary's instinct that these men were not the savage enemies of frontier stories. They examined the pine nuts carefully, looked around the area with obvious puzzlement, and engaged in what appeared to be a serious discussion about the implications of finding such a gift in this remote location. The youngest member of the group spent considerable time studying tracks around the campsite, eventually following a trail that led directly toward Mary's hiding place. For a terrifying moment, she thought she had been discovered, but the young tracker stopped just short of her position and returned to his companions with information she couldn't hear. After another discussion, the hunting party left the canyon, but not before leaving their own gift beside the stream. A small leather pouch containing dried meat, some kind of concentrated food cake, and several items Mary didn't recognize but assumed were medicines or tools. The message was clear. They acknowledged her presence, respected her need for secrecy, and offered help without forcing contact. The exchange marked a turning point in Mary's canyon experience. She was no longer simply surviving in isolation. She had established a tentative communication with other humans who understood this environment better than anyone. The food they left was more nutritious and sustaining than anything she had been able to find on her own, and it gave her strength for the challenges that still lay ahead. But the interaction also highlighted how much she had changed during her weeks in the wilderness. The girl who had fallen into Devil's Canyon while picking berries for her family was gone, replaced by someone who thought like a wild animal, moved like a creature of the rocks, and communicated through gestures that transcended the boundaries of language and culture. High above on the canyon rim, Running Wolf continued his patient observation of the white girl's progress. He had been present during the hunting party's visit to the canyon floor, though Mary had never noticed him. He had watched her careful surveillance of his relatives, and her decision to make contact through gifts rather than direct approach. Most importantly, he had seen how she moved through the canyon with increasing skill and confidence. The time was approaching when Running Wolf would face his own moment of decision. The girl had survived longer than anyone thought possible, but winter was coming, and even the most skilled survivor would struggle against the canyon's harsh cold without proper preparation. The question was no longer whether she deserved to be rescued, but whether she could be rescued without destroying the wild creature she had become. As Mary settled into sleep in her cave that night, warmed by a small fire and sustained by the generous gift of food, she had no way of knowing that her survival story was entering its final phase. The choices made by both Mary and her unseen observer in the next few days would determine not just her survival, but the kind of person she would become when she finally emerged from Devil's Canyon into the larger world beyond. Running Wolf had been watching the white girl for 18 days when he first realized she might survive the canyon that had claimed so many others before her. From his hidden position on the canyon rim, the young Crow scout had observed her transformation from terrified child to skilled survivor, and what he saw challenged everything he had been taught about the white settlers who continued to pour across his people's ancestral lands. At 19 years old, Running Wolf represented a generation of Native Americans caught between two worlds. He had been born into the traditional ways of his people, but had lived through the devastating changes brought by white expansion into the West. He had seen his grandfather's buffalo hunting grounds turned into cattle ranches, watched sacred sites destroyed by miners seeking gold, and witnessed the slow starvation of his people as their traditional food sources disappeared. The previous winter had been particularly harsh for his band of Crow. Government promises of food and supplies had proven empty, and many of the elderly and children had died of hunger and cold. Running Wolf's own younger sister had succumbed to a white man's disease for which traditional medicines provided no cure. The bitterness these losses created had hardened his heart against all white people, making them enemies to be avoided or eliminated, rather than fellow human beings deserving of compassion. Yet this girl in the canyon challenged his assumptions in ways he couldn't ignore. She wasn't behaving like the white settlers he had learned to despise. Instead of trying to dominate and change the landscape, she was learning to live within it. Instead of taking everything she could find, she gathered only what she needed and seemed to understand the importance of leaving resources for other creatures. Most remarkably, she had somehow learned to read the canyon's subtle signs and warnings in ways that reminded Running Wolf of his own childhood education in survival skills. When flash floods threatened, she sought high ground before the storms arrived. When predators were active in an area, she found alternate routes that avoided dangerous encounters. She moved through the terrain with increasing confidence, but never with the arrogance that characterized most white interactions with the natural world. Running Wolf's internal conflict deepened as he watched the girl's interactions with the hunting party that included his uncle and cousin. Her decision to communicate through gifts rather than direct contact showed a wisdom about intertribal relations that few adults possessed. The choice to remain hidden while acknowledging their presence demonstrated both humility and intelligence. But it was her response to their reciprocal gift that truly impressed the young scout. Instead of consuming the entire offering immediately, as a desperate person might, she carefully rationed the food and shared portions of it with the canyon's wildlife. Running Wolf watched in amazement as she deliberately left small portions of dried meat near water sources where she had observed other creatures coming to drink. This behavior suggested an understanding of reciprocity and balance that was fundamental to Crow philosophy. The hunting party had included Running Wolf's uncle, Greyhawk, a respected elder who had fought against white soldiers and settlers for most of his adult life. When the party returned to their temporary camp on the canyon rim, Greyhawk sought out his nephew to discuss what they had discovered. "There is a white child living in the deep places of Devil's Canyon," Greyhawk said without preamble. "She has been there for many days, perhaps weeks. She knows how to find water and food, and she moves like one of the old ones who understood how to live with the land rather than against it." Running Wolf feigned surprise, though he had been expecting this conversation since watching his uncle study the girl's tracks around their campsite. "What will you do with this knowledge?" he asked carefully. Greyhawk considered his words before responding. "The child shows respect for our ways, even though she has never been taught them. She takes only what she needs and gives back to the land. These are not the behaviors of our enemies." He paused, studying his nephew's face. "But she is still white, and winter comes soon to the canyon. Without proper shelter and warm clothes, she will not survive when the snows begin." The conversation revealed the complexity of the situation Running Wolf faced. Even his uncle, whose family had suffered greatly at the hands of white settlers, felt some obligation to help a child who demonstrated respect for Crow values. But direct intervention carried enormous risks for both the girl and his people. Contact with white authorities inevitably brought trouble for Native Americans, even when their intentions were helpful. If Running Wolf revealed the girl's location to white searchers, questions would arise about how long the Crow had known of her presence and why they hadn't reported it earlier. Such questions could lead to accusations of kidnapping or worse, providing justification for military action against his people. But allowing the girl to die when they had the knowledge and ability to save her violated fundamental principles of Crow morality. Children were considered sacred regardless of their tribal affiliation. and abandoning a child to death was unthinkable to people who valued their own children above all other treasures. Running Wolf found himself caught between loyalty to his people and a growing respect for the white girl whose survival skills and spiritual approach to the land had earned his admiration. The solution he eventually chose reflected both his intelligence and his compassion, though it would require careful planning and considerable personal risk. Rather than revealing the girl's presence to either white or Indian authorities, Running Wolf decided to become her secret guardian, providing indirect assistance that would improve her chances of survival without forcing contact that might endanger either of them. It was a decision that would test his own survival skills and require him to violate tribal customs about contact with white people. His first intervention came during the girl's 4th week in the canyon, when Running Wolf observed that her food gathering was becoming less successful, as easily accessible sources were depleted. Rather than revealing better locations directly, he began a subtle campaign of guidance that would appear to be natural discoveries. Working during the pre-dawn hours when the girl was still sleeping in her caves, Running Wolf would disturb vegetation around particularly rich food sources, making them more visible to someone passing through the area. He carefully broke branches that obscured productive berry bushes, cleared debris from around edible root systems, and created subtle path markers that would guide the girl towards resources she might otherwise miss. The technique required considerable skill and understanding of both the girl's movement patterns and the canyon's natural processes. Running Wolf's modifications had to appear completely natural while still being obvious enough to catch the attention of someone actively foraging for food. Too much disturbance would make the girl suspicious and cautious. Too little would be ineffective. His efforts proved successful as he watched the girl discover and exploit food sources that she had previously overlooked. Her nutrition improved noticeably, and she seemed to gain confidence as her foraging became more productive. But Running Wolf's most important intervention came when he realized that the girl's cave system, while providing excellent shelter from heat and storms, would become a death trap when winter temperatures arrived. Devil's Canyon was notorious for its harsh winters. Snow could accumulate to depths that made travel impossible, and temperatures regularly dropped far below zero. Even with good shelter, warm clothes, and adequate food stores, survival was challenging for experienced mountain dwellers. For a 13-year-old girl wearing the remnants of a cotton dress, winter in the canyon would be fatal within days. Running Wolf began scouting for better shelter options, looking for caves or rock formations that would provide protection from wind and snow while still being accessible to someone with the girl's climbing abilities. He eventually located a deep cave system on the canyon's southern wall that would be perfect for winter survival. But it was located more than a mile from the girl's current shelter and would require her to cross some of the most treacherous terrain in the canyon. The challenge was guiding the girl to the new shelter without revealing his presence or making her suspicious about the discovery. Running Wolf spent several days planning an approach that would seem natural while still being effective. His solution demonstrated both creativity and deep understanding of human psychology. Rather than trying to guide the girl directly, Running Wolf decided to use the canyon's wildlife as intermediaries. He knew that the girl had learned to follow ravens to water sources and observe other animals for survival information. By carefully manipulating the behavior of certain animals, he could create a trail of natural signs that would lead her toward better shelter. The plan required him to work with animals he had been observing and feeding for several weeks, primarily a family of ravens that had grown accustomed to finding food scraps near his observation posts. Ravens were highly intelligent and could be influenced by strategic food placement, though they remained wild and unpredictable. Over the course of a week, Running Wolf gradually moved his feeding locations closer to the cave system he wanted the girl to discover. The ravens, naturally following their food source, began to establish new territory in that area. Their calls and activities created a level of disturbance that would naturally attract the girl's attention during her daily foraging expeditions. At the same time, Running Wolf created subtle signs of animal activity along the route between the girl's current shelter and the winter cave system. He placed small amounts of food at strategic locations, attracting various small animals whose tracks and scent markings would create a trail that appeared completely natural but would guide an observant person toward the better shelter. The manipulation required careful timing and extensive knowledge of animal behavior. Running Wolf had to ensure that his interventions would be effective without being obvious, creating a chain of cause and effect that would appear to be natural wildlife activity rather than human guidance. His efforts were rewarded when the girl began following the enhanced animal activity toward the new cave system. She moved cautiously, as she had learned to do in all her canyon explorations, but she clearly sensed that something interesting was happening in that direction. Her growing confidence in reading natural signs served her well, as she interpreted the various tracks and markers that Running Wolf had helped to create. When she finally discovered the winter cave system, Her reaction confirmed Running Wolf's assessment of her intelligence and survival instincts. Rather than immediately moving to the new shelter, she spent several days carefully exploring and evaluating the site. She tested the cave's drainage during rainstorms, examined its protection from wind and weather, and assessed its accessibility during different conditions. Only after thorough investigation did she begin the process of relocating her most essential supplies to the new shelter. The move took place gradually over several days, with the girl maintaining her original cave as a backup, while establishing the winter cave as her primary shelter. The caution she displayed impressed Running Wolf, who recognized the wisdom of maintaining multiple shelter options in an environment where conditions could change rapidly. But the most remarkable aspect of the girl's behavior during this transition was her apparent awareness that she was being helped. Though she never showed any sign of seeing Running Wolf or detecting his presence directly, her actions suggested that she sensed some kind of guidance or protection. She began leaving small gifts at locations where she had found particularly valuable resources, offerings that seemed directed toward whatever force was helping her survive. These gifts consisted mainly of choice food items, carefully arranged in patterns that couldn't be mistaken for natural occurrence. Sometimes, she would leave a small pile of the best nuts she had gathered, or arrange berries in a circle around a water source. The offerings were modest but clearly intentional, representing a significant sacrifice from someone living on the edge of starvation. Running Wolf was deeply moved by these gestures, which demonstrated a spiritual understanding that transcended cultural boundaries. The girl seemed to grasp the principle of reciprocity that was fundamental to Crow philosophy, the idea that all gifts must be acknowledged, and that survival depended on maintaining balance between taking and giving. Her gifts created a dilemma for Running Wolf, who wanted to acknowledge her gestures without revealing his presence. His solution reflected both his ingenuity and his growing emotional investment in the girl's welfare. He began leaving his own small offerings near places where the girl would find them. A handful of especially nutritious seeds, a piece of well-made cordage that could be useful for various purposes, or sometimes just a beautifully crafted stone arrangement that would let her know her gifts had been received and appreciated. This exchange of offerings created a wordless communication between the hidden scout and the lost girl, a relationship based on mutual respect and spiritual understanding rather than direct contact. For both of them, it represented something precious and unique, a connection that transcended the bitter divisions between their peoples, and spoke to fundamental human values of compassion and mutual aid. As autumn progressed and the first hints of winter began to appear in the canyon, Running Wolf realized that his secret guardianship was entering its most critical phase. The indirect assistance that had been sufficient during the warm months would not be enough to ensure the girl's survival through a full winter. Harder choices lay ahead, decisions that would test both his loyalty to his people and his commitment to preserving a life that had come to matter deeply to him. The question was no longer whether the girl deserved to be saved, but whether she could be saved without destroying the fragile trust that had developed between them, and without endangering the safety of Running Wolf's own family and tribal community. Winter in Devil's Canyon was unforgiving, and even the most careful planning might not be enough to preserve a life that hung by such a slender thread. The first snow of winter arrived in Devil's Canyon on a crystalline October morning, falling like silent warnings between the towering stone walls. Mary Catherine Walsh woke in her winter cave to find delicate white flakes drifting through cracks in the rock ceiling, and she knew that the relative comfort of her autumn survival was about to be tested by forces that could kill her within hours if she made the wrong choices. During her weeks in the canyon, Mary had grown from a lost 13-year-old into something approaching a wild creature, but winter presented challenges that no amount of resourcefulness could overcome without proper preparation. The cotton dress she had worn into the canyon was now little more than strategic rags held together by strips of plant fiber she had learned to weave. Her shoes had long since disintegrated, leaving her to navigate the rocky terrain on bare feet that had grown tough as leather but offered no protection against freezing temperatures. The cave system that Running Wolf had guided her to discover represented her best hope for winter survival. But even these well-protected chambers would become death traps if she couldn't solve the fundamental problems of warmth and nutrition during the months when the canyon would be locked in snow and ice. Mary had learned much about the canyon's resources during her autumn residency, but winter survival required knowledge and skills that no pioneer girl from Ohio could be expected to possess. She needed to understand which plants could be preserved for winter nutrition, how to create effective insulation from natural materials, and how to maintain fire during conditions that would challenge even experienced woodsmen. Her most immediate concern was fuel for heating and cooking. The canyon contained limited wood, mostly in the form of small bushes and scattered deadfall that would burn quickly and provide little sustained heat. She had been gathering and storing every piece of burnable material she could find, creating caches in various caves, but her supply was pitifully inadequate for heating through a full winter. The solution came through careful observation of animal behavior, particularly the activities of pack rats and other small mammals that were also preparing for winter survival. These creatures had been gathering organic materials throughout the summer and fall, creating insulated nests in protected locations throughout the canyon. Mary began studying these natural shelters, learning techniques for insulation and heat retention that she could adapt to her own needs. She discovered that certain dried grasses and plant fibers, when woven together and packed tightly, could create surprisingly effective insulation. The pack rats had also shown her that small spaces were easier to heat than large ones, leading her to focus on making her cave sleeping area as compact as possible while still allowing for proper ventilation. But her most important discovery came when she found evidence of how previous human inhabitants had survived canyon winters. Deep in her cave system, she discovered a chamber that contained the remains of an ancient heating system. A carefully constructed arrangement of stones that had been used to capture and radiate heat from small fires. The system allowed for efficient fuel use while distributing warmth throughout a larger area than would be possible with an open fire. Reconstructing this heating system required skills Mary had never imagined needing. She had to select stones of the right size and type, arrange them to create proper airflow, and understand the principles of heat capture and radiation. The work was physically demanding and technically challenging, but it represented her best hope for surviving freezing temperatures with limited fuel. As she worked on improving her winter shelter, Mary remained unaware that Running Wolf was facing his own crisis of conscience about her survival. The Crow Scout had spent weeks providing indirect assistance, but winter presented challenges that couldn't be solved through subtle guidance and hidden gifts. Direct intervention would be necessary to save her life, but such action would violate tribal customs and potentially endanger his own people. Running Wolf's dilemma was complicated by changes in his own circumstances. His band of Crow had been forced to relocate their winter camp due to pressure from white settlers and military patrols, moving further from Devil's Canyon, and making his secret guardianship much more difficult to maintain. The daily observation that had allowed him to monitor Mary's progress and provide assistance was no longer possible without neglecting his responsibilities to his own family and community. The solution he chose reflected both his commitment to preserving life and his understanding of the complex political realities that governed Indian-white relations in the territory. Rather than abandoning Mary entirely or revealing her presence to white authorities, Running Wolf decided to prepare a survival cache that would give her the tools and knowledge needed to survive winter without ongoing assistance. Creating such a cache required careful planning and considerable personal sacrifice. Running Wolf would have to provide materials from his own family's winter supplies, potentially endangering his relative's survival for the sake of a white child. The decision represented a profound act of faith in human values that transcended tribal boundaries. Working during the pre-dawn hours when Mary was least likely to be moving through the canyon, Running Wolf began assembling a collection of items that could mean the difference between life and death during the harsh months ahead. The cache included warm clothing made from animal skins, preserved food that would provide essential nutrition, fire-making materials that would be more reliable than the primitive methods Mary had been using, and tools that would allow her to create better shelter and gather food more effectively. But perhaps the most valuable items in the cache were instructional materials, pieces of decorated bark that contained pictographic information about winter survival techniques used by his people for generations. These teaching materials showed how to construct effective windbreaks, create emergency shelter during blizzards, preserve body heat during extreme cold, and find food sources that remained available even when snow covered the ground. The pictographs represented a form of knowledge transfer that could cross cultural boundaries without requiring direct contact between teacher and student. Running Wolf had learned these symbols during his own childhood education, and he hoped that Mary's demonstrated intelligence and survival instincts would allow her to interpret and apply the information they contained. Placing the cache required the same careful planning that had characterized all of Running Wolf's previous interventions. The materials had to be positioned where Mary would find them but protected from weather and animals until that discovery occurred. They also needed to be presented in a way that would seem like a natural discovery rather than a deliberate gift, maintaining the fiction of Mary's independent survival. Running Wolf chose a location near one of Mary's regular foraging routes, a protected alcove in the rock wall that would shelter the materials from snow and rain. He wrapped everything in waterproof materials made from treated animal skins and arranged the cache to look like the forgotten supplies of previous travelers rather than a deliberate offering. To ensure that Mary would discover the cache when she needed it most, Running Wolf created a trail of subtle signs that would guide her attention to the hiding place. These markers were designed to be obvious to someone actively looking for survival resources while remaining invisible to casual observation. Mary discovered the cache during her second week of snow, at a time when her own supplies were running dangerously low and her confidence in winter survival was beginning to falter. The discovery seemed miraculous, a treasure trove of exactly the material she needed most desperately. Her reaction revealed both her practical intelligence and her spiritual understanding of the mysterious forces that had been helping her survive. Rather than immediately using everything in the cache, Mary spent considerable time studying each item and trying to understand its intended purpose. The worn clothing was obviously valuable, but she examined the construction techniques used in making it, learning principles that would help her create similar items from materials available in the canyon. The preserved food provided immediate nutrition, but she also studied the preservation methods, gaining knowledge that would help her extend her own food supplies. The pictographic instruction materials proved most challenging but ultimately most valuable. Mary had never seen such symbolic communication, but her weeks in the canyon had taught her to pay attention to patterns and details that might contain important information. She approached the pictographs like puzzles to be solved, studying each symbol and trying to understand its relationship to survival challenges she was facing. Her success in interpreting the pictographs demonstrated the remarkable adaptation that had taken place during her months in the canyon. The sheltered pioneer girl from Ohio had developed observational skills and pattern recognition abilities that allowed her to learn from teaching materials created by a completely different culture. The process required patience, intelligence, and the kind of creative thinking that emerges when survival depends on making maximum use of limited resources. Some pictographs were relatively straightforward, showing techniques for creating windbreaks or constructing emergency shelters that Mary could understand and implement immediately. Others were more complex, requiring her to experiment with different interpretations until she found approaches that worked in her specific circumstances. The process of learning from the pictographs became one of Mary's primary activities during the long winter days when weather conditions made foraging and other outdoor work impossible. She created her own copies of the symbols, using charcoal and flat stones, adding her own annotations based on her experiments and discoveries. This creative interaction with Running Wolf's teaching materials resulted in survival innovations that combined traditional Crow knowledge with Mary's own insights and the unique challenges of her situation. She developed heating techniques that were more efficient than what either culture had used independently, created clothing designs that incorporated both traditional and improvised materials, and invented food preservation methods that maximized nutrition while using minimal resources. As winter deepened and the canyon became locked in snow and ice, Mary's survival began to represent something unprecedented, a successful fusion of pioneer determination with Native American survival wisdom, mediated by the mutual respect and spiritual understanding that had developed between a lost girl and her hidden guardian. But the winter that was testing Mary's survival skills was also challenging Running Wolf's ability to maintain his secret protection. Weather conditions made travel to the canyon extremely difficult, and his responsibilities to his own community required his presence during the harsh months when everyone's survival depended on careful resource management and mutual support. The question of whether Mary would survive her first winter in Devil's Canyon was becoming secondary to larger questions about what kind of person she was becoming and what would happen when spring finally arrived to end her isolation. The experience was transforming her in ways that would affect not just her own future, but potentially the relationships between the cultures that had shaped her survival. As the winter solstice approached and the canyon settled into its deepest cold, both Mary and Running Wolf faced the reality that their strange partnership was approaching a crucial test. The months ahead would determine whether the mutual trust and respect they had developed could sustain a life hanging by the most fragile of threads, and whether the lessons learned in Devil's Canyon could survive contact with the larger world that waited beyond its protective walls. The spring of 1888 came to Devil's Canyon like a whispered promise, beginning with the subtle lengthening of days and the first tentative melting of ice along the protected southern walls. Mary Catherine Walsh, who had entered the canyon as a 13-year-old pioneer girl picking berries for her family, emerged from her winter cave as someone fundamentally transformed by 7 months of survival that had tested every assumption about human adaptability and the boundaries between cultures. The girl who greeted the spring sunrise bore little resemblance to the child who had fallen into the canyon the previous summer. Her hair, now reaching past her shoulders, had been braided with plant fibers in a style that served both practical and decorative purposes. Her clothing represented a unique fusion of pioneer ingenuity and Native American technique. animal skins and woven plant fibers combined with salvaged elements of her original dress to create garments that were both functional and beautiful. But the most profound changes were internal, visible only in the way she moved through her environment with the silent confidence of a creature completely at home in the wilderness. And in her eyes, which now held depths of knowledge and spiritual understanding that would have been impossible for any traditionally raised frontier child to possess. Mary's winter survival had required her to master skills that few people of any culture ever needed to learn. She had become expert at reading weather patterns days in advance, predicting the movement of water and ice through the canyon's complex drainage systems. She could track animals by signs so subtle that even experienced hunters might miss them, and she had developed an almost supernatural ability to locate food and water sources in seemingly barren terrain. More importantly, she had learned to think like the land itself, understanding the interconnected relationships between all living things in ways that reflected the deepest wisdom of indigenous cultures. Her approach to survival was no longer based on dominating or exploiting her environment, but on finding her place within natural systems that had been operating successfully for thousands of years. The pictographic lessons left by Running Wolf had been crucial to her winter survival, but Mary's interpretation and application of those teachings had gone beyond simple mimicry. She had created her own innovations and improvements, developing techniques that were uniquely suited to her specific circumstances, while remaining true to the underlying principles of living in harmony with the natural world. As spring progressed and travel became possible again, Running Wolf resumed his secret observation of Mary's progress. What he saw both impressed and concerned him. The girl had not only survived the harsh winter, but had emerged stronger and more capable than before. Her shelter improvements showed sophisticated understanding of engineering principles. Her food storage systems demonstrated long-term planning abilities, and her daily routines reflected the kind of spiritual discipline that was normally achieved only after years of traditional training. But Running Wolf also recognized that Mary's adaptation to canyon life had been so complete that returning to white society would present enormous challenges. She had learned to communicate with the natural world in ways that would seem like madness to people who viewed nature as something to be conquered rather than understood. Her survival skills, while impressive in the wilderness, would be meaningless and potentially frightening in the context of frontier towns and settlements. The approach of spring also brought practical concerns that would force decisions about Mary's future. Warmer weather would bring travelers through the area, increasing the likelihood that her presence would be discovered by people who might not understand or respect the delicate balance she had achieved with her environment. Military patrols, hunting parties, and early pioneer families would all pose potential threats to the secret world she had created in Devil's Canyon. Running Wolf faced his own difficult choices as well. His band of Crow had survived the winter, but remained under pressure from territorial authorities who were increasingly suspicious of any Native American presence near white settlements. Continuing his guardianship of Mary required him to make trips to the canyon that could be misinterpreted by both white and Indian authorities as signs of hostile activity. The crisis that would force these decisions came in late April, when a military patrol searching for reported Indian activity in the area established a temporary camp near the canyon rim. The soldiers were investigating claims by local ranchers that livestock had been stolen by hostile Indians, and their presence made it impossible for Running Wolf to continue his secret visits to check on Mary's welfare. More dangerously, the military patrol was conducting systematic searches of the canyon itself, looking for caves and hiding places that might be used by war parties or raiders. It was only a matter of time before they discovered evidence of Mary's presence, and Running Wolf knew that such a discovery could have catastrophic consequences for everyone involved. If the soldiers found Mary and learned that she had been surviving in the canyon for months without reporting her presence to authorities, questions would inevitably arise about how she had managed such an unlikely survival. Any investigation would quickly reveal evidence of the assistance she had received, leading to accusations that local Indians had been hiding her for unknown but presumably hostile purposes. Such accusations could provide justification for military action against Running Wolf's people, potentially leading to forced removal from their current territory, or worse. The safety of his entire community was at stake, and Running Wolf realized that his secret guardianship had reached a point where it endangered more lives than it protected. The solution he chose reflected both his courage and his wisdom, that it required him to violate the most fundamental rule of his secret relationship with Mary, the prohibition against direct contact. For the first time since he had begun watching her, Running Wolf would have to reveal himself and trust that the mutual respect they had developed through wordless communication would translate into understanding when they finally met face to face. He chose his moment carefully, approaching Mary's cave during the early morning hours when she typically emerged to gather water and check her various food sources. Running Wolf positioned himself in a location where she would see him clearly, but where he could retreat quickly if her reaction indicated fear or hostility. When Mary first saw the young Crow scout standing motionless among the rocks near her cave, her initial reaction was not fear, but recognition. Though she had never seen Running Wolf directly, some part of her had always known that her survival depended on help from another human being. The gifts, the subtle guidance, the survival cache that had appeared exactly when she needed it most. All of these had suggested the presence of someone who understood her situation and cared about her welfare. The meeting between Mary and Running Wolf was conducted almost entirely without words, relying on the gestural communication they had developed through months of indirect contact. Running Wolf showed her tracks and signs indicating the approach of the military patrol, making it clear that her hidden sanctuary was about to be discovered. Mary understood immediately that her time in the canyon was ending, whether she was ready or not, but the conversation that followed, conducted through a mixture of simple English words, Crow phrases, and the pictographic symbols that Mary had learned to interpret, revealed the depth of understanding that had developed between them. Both recognized that Mary's survival had created something unprecedented. A bridge between cultures that transcended the bitter conflicts and misunderstandings that normally characterized Indian-white relations in the territory. Running Wolf explained as best he could in their limited shared vocabulary that Mary's return to white society would require careful planning to protect both her and his people from the suspicions and accusations that would inevitably arise. Simply appearing after months of assumed death would raise questions that could endanger everyone who had been involved in her survival. Mary, whose months in the canyon had given her a maturity far beyond her 14 years, understood the complexity of the situation immediately. Her survival story, if told truthfully, would reveal the assistance she had received from Native Americans at a time when such cooperation was viewed with suspicion by both military and civilian authorities. But any false story would dishonor the people who had saved her life and betray the spiritual understanding she had gained through her wilderness experience. The solution they developed together reflected both practical wisdom and deep respect for truth. Mary would return to white society, but she would tell a carefully constructed version of her survival story that emphasized her own resourcefulness while avoiding details that might implicate Native American assistance. She would claim to have learned survival skills through observation and experimentation, which was essentially true, while omitting the guidance and support that had made such learning possible. To support this narrative, Running Wolf helped Mary create physical evidence that would corroborate her story of independent survival. They gathered examples of the tools and techniques she had developed, arranged her caves to show evidence of gradual learning and improvement, and prepared explanations for her survival skills that would seem plausible to people who had never attempted such extreme self-reliance. But the most important part of their plan involved the spiritual and cultural understanding that Mary had gained during her time in the canyon. This knowledge represented a treasure more valuable than any material survival skills, but it was also the most dangerous element of her story from the perspective of white society's prejudices and fears. Running Wolf helped Mary understand that her transformation during the canyon months had made her into something that existed between cultures, someone who could serve as a bridge between worlds if she was wise enough to navigate the prejudices and misunderstandings of both sides. But such a role would require her to guard carefully the secrets of her survival, while still honoring the teachings and assistance she had received. The day of Mary's return to the white world was carefully orchestrated to seem like a natural discovery rather than a planned emergence. Running Wolf guided her to a location where she would be found by a search party that included members of her own family, who had never given up hope that she might still be alive despite the many months that had passed since her disappearance. Thomas and Elizabeth Walsh had spent the winter months in the nearest settlement, working to earn money for continued searching while caring for their two younger sons. They had organized numerous search parties throughout the fall and winter, exploring every accessible part of Devil's Canyon and the surrounding territory. Their persistence in searching for Mary had made them familiar figures to local authorities and had established their presence in the area in ways that would make her reappearance less suspicious. When Mary was finally discovered by one of these search parties, emaciated but alive and displaying remarkable survival skills, the story that spread through the territory emphasized her remarkable resourcefulness and the lucky circumstances that had allowed her to find adequate shelter and food sources. The tale became one of pioneer determination and self-reliance, inspiring other families facing the challenges of frontier life. But for Mary herself, the return to civilization represented both a homecoming and a profound loss. The girl who had learned to communicate with ravens and read the messages written in animal tracks now had to readjust to a world where such skills were viewed as eccentricities at best and signs of mental disturbance at worst. The spiritual understanding she had gained through her relationship with the natural world had to be hidden beneath the conventional religious beliefs expected of a pioneer family. Most painfully, she had to live with the knowledge that the person who had saved her life remained invisible and unacknowledged, unable to receive the gratitude and recognition he deserved, because of the racial prejudices and political tensions that dominated relationships between whites and Indians in the territory. Mary's readjustment to family life in frontier society was complicated by the changes that had occurred in her absence. Her parents had aged visibly during the months of searching and worry, and her younger brothers had grown and changed in ways that made her feel like a stranger in her own family. The simple routines of domestic life seemed artificial and confining, after months of living in direct relationship with natural cycles and environmental demands. But perhaps most difficult was the realization that her survival story, while inspiring to others, represented only the surface of an experience that had transformed her understanding of what it meant to be human in relationship to the natural world and to other cultures. The deeper truths of her canyon experience had to remain secret, shared only with the wind and rocks that had witnessed her transformation. As the Walsh family prepared to continue their journey to Oregon Territory, Mary found ways to honor the teachings and assistance she had received while maintaining the fiction of independent survival. She became known for her unusual ability to find water in dry country, to predict weather changes, and to locate food sources that other travelers missed. These skills made her family valuable members of any wagon train, but Mary never revealed the true source of her knowledge. Years later, as an adult living in Oregon, Mary Catherine Walsh would become known as a woman who possessed an unusual understanding of Native American cultures and served as an informal mediator in conflicts between white settlers and local tribes. Her ability to communicate across cultural boundaries and her deep respect for indigenous knowledge made her a bridge between worlds in ways that few people of her generation could achieve. But she never forgot Running Wolf, the young Crow Scout whose courage and compassion had saved her life and whose teachings had given her a spiritual understanding that would guide her for the rest of her days. In the small garden behind her Oregon home, she maintained a collection of plants and stones arranged according to principles she had learned in Devil's Canyon, a private shrine to the wisdom and generosity that had allowed her to survive when survival seemed impossible. The story of Mary Catherine Walsh and Running Wolf represents one of the countless untold chapters in the complex history of relationships between cultures in the American West. It suggests possibilities for understanding and cooperation that transcended the bitter conflicts and tragic misunderstandings that characterized most interactions between Native Americans and white settlers during that era. Their relationship, conducted entirely through indirect communication and mutual respect, demonstrated that human compassion and wisdom could bridge even the most profound cultural divides when people were willing to see beyond the prejudices and fears that typically separated them. It was a lesson that Mary carried with her throughout her life, and one that Running Wolf passed on to his own children and grandchildren, as an example of the deeper truths that connected all people, regardless of their cultural backgrounds. In the end, the girl who vanished in Devil's Canyon and the scout who saved her created something that neither of their cultures had prepared them for. A relationship based on pure human understanding that honored the wisdom of both traditions while pointing toward possibilities for cooperation and mutual respect that would not be widely recognized for generations to come.